Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, 2021, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia, Fable, ARC, and Adobe, and Gold supporter, Tetralogical. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag for our Q&A at the end of the session. I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Sarah Higley, our guest host. And Sarah, over to you.
Hi, I'm really excited about this session. We have Claire Weber and Sarah Police talking about annotating designs for accessibility. Over to you, Sarah and Claire.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and also to all the ID24 crew who I know work really hard to put on this event. As Sarah mentioned, I am also Sarah, just a different one, and I'm one of the directors at Intopia. If you are on Twitter today, feel free to either contact me or tag me as Sarah TP. That's Sarah with an HTP. Over to you, Claire.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Claire Weber. I'm a digital accessibility consultant with Intopia. You can find me on Twitter at Claire L. Weber, and that's Claire with an I and an E. Back to you, Sarah.
Fantastic. So today we actually wanted to chat to you about annotation systems for accessibility. So our slides are up on SlideShare already. We will share that URL with you at the end, so you don't have to madly take down any notes. Plus, we also have published our very first annotation kit that we have been working on, and Claire will actually provide some information about how to find that during the presentation. So what are we going to talk about today? So first of all, I just wanted to kind of start by touching on what is accessible design and why it is important. We then want to look at what are those annotations and also provide you with some examples of how annotations can be used. We will use our own Figma kit as for the examples, but really anything we talk about can be done using other kits that are out there, or even if you want to build your own. And then lastly, we just want to talk about what's next, what you can do with annotations, as well as what's next for us as well. So when we talk about accessible design, look, there are different, I guess, definitions people might use for what accessible design is. But for me, when I think about accessible design, at its most fundamental, it's really about the creation of experiences for everyone, experiences that do provide equal access. It also means that we are designing for all user needs. And usually that word accessible does come along with, certain, I guess, user groups that we want to make sure we include. And that includes people with permanent, temporary, or situational disability. Now, you may have heard of the shift left model and how it can be applied to accessibility. The shift left model is really common across like DevOps, so that development and operations area, and it really encourages quality to be addressed as early on in the sort of design development process as possible. So the image on the screen shows a more traditional quality model where testing is left quite late on in the process. So where we have more that formalized testing and deployment and release cycle. This can be done in Agile. Sometimes, testing, certainly Agile means testing is done earlier, but it still means that testing is done quite late on in the process, often after design and development. Now, the result of this is that issues are picked up late on in the process, and this makes it much more costly to fix. Statistics have shown, it can be up to 30 times to fix an issue if we actually wait to that test and deployment stage. The shift left model is where we actually want to bring that quality in as early on as possible. So much more around that planning and design phase. That's when we want to get as much of that quality in as possible. And then over time, as we move through our development and build and test and deploy, actually that need for quality check drops off because we've done as much as we can as early on as possible. Now, I've been working in accessibility a fair while now, And, I remember times where accessibility was considered only the responsibility of the developer, and also that accessibility was done generally at the end of the project. And I've got to admit, we still, we're a consultancy, we still have people knocking on our door wanting to do testing at the end. But I see that that is definitely improving. And that concept of shift left accessibility and that everyone has a role to play in accessibility, it is much more prevalent. So too is that understanding that when we do include accessibility in that planning and design process, it's that time where we can actually understand and consider all user needs. By doing so, we're just building better experiences. When we leave accessibility later on in the process, particularly when we find issues, we tend to apply a Band-Aid, and I realize that actually is probably an Australian word. I think it's elastoplast in the US. But basically we sort of put a sticky plaster over it, as opposed to often being able to redesign or redevelop something in a much, much more accessible way. So by bringing accessibility into the design where it should naturally start and naturally sit, well, even really into requirements gathering, designers, though, are making decisions about how an experience will meet user needs. Now, some of these design decisions might just be present in the designs. I'm going to put a form element here, not there. But there are some decisions that will need to be communicated from the design team through to the development and testers. And that is really where annotations shine.
So let's have a look a little bit more around annotations now. So as Sarah mentioned, annotations and documentation is a key way we can help build that communication in teams and really bring the accessibility focus up really early into the project. So what do we mean specifically by annotations, and what are we looking to achieve here? So by annotations, as I mentioned, we're talking about further documentation for the design. So like an architectural blueprint, we want all the information to be clear upfront. If something's missing in the plans, like for instance, how thick the foundations will be for the house, then the house might fall down. The same with accessibility. If some key information we've made a decision of upfront in the design is missing and not documented, as we move further down the process, things are going to be wobbly and the accessibility is going to be impacted. So as we're doing great work moving accessibility forwards, we need to make sure we're documenting it and making it really consistent, building that common understanding throughout the whole team, the whole project, and making information and documentation really easy and quick to act upon. Annotating our designs with accessibility information is a really powerful way to focus on accessibility early in the design stage. And what are the real core benefits of this? So firstly, it'll save time, as Sarah mentioned, in the project in general. When we're bringing that documentation up front, it really helps speed up things later in the project. It also brings more conversations up front in the design. We can, before we invest heavily in the design and commit to something, we can consider how it's going to impact accessibility and make changes before it becomes too difficult to do that. Also bringing more eyes across the project and building collaboration in teams. More people will be looking at the accessibility when we bring it earlier and increasing that communication and collaboration through our different teams. As Sarah mentioned, it also helps build test cases later on, making that really clear what's required for accessibility and what we're expecting in the end product will help build test cases when we work closely with our test team. Building these annotations and documentation up front also will help increase accessibility knowledge across your whole organization. Lots of people, lots of stakeholders have eyes over design. When we include those annotations and that documentation up front, it gets more people thinking about accessibility earlier. It also really puts it into practice and embeds accessibility as a way of working in your organization.
So I actually think it was about 5 years ago when I was attending the CSUN conference. I actually attended a presentation by Jack Nicolai from Adobe. And in that presentation, he actually spoke about different tools, techniques, and practices that he was using or his team was using for including accessibility requirements in projects. And in that presentation, he actually spoke about how he was communicating accessibility information using accessibility annotations. These could be added to wireframes or visual designs to show things like tab order, or if there were keyboard shortcuts or assistive technology output. He actually called them accessibility blue lines. I think that came from red lines we used to use to sort of mark up things like spacing and touch targets. So he called them blue lines for accessibility. Now, that was probably about 5 years ago, but actually in the last year, we have seen other accessibility annotation kits starting to pop up. So Jack Nicolai's annotations were actually turned into plugins or what are they called, Claire?
I think that one in particular, there's a few kits across Sketch, Adobe XD, Illustrator, and InVision, heaps of stuff available.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So that we saw that sort of pop up, but there's other ones that have also been popping up in the Sketch and Figma communities, such as ones from Indeed and Twitter and GitLab. Now, we've kind of been beavering away on our own kit in the background. And as of today, it is actually published in the Figma community. So when we were looking at our kit, it actually does take some basis from Jack's work, but we were looking to address a few things that we saw within those kits and other kits, some general housekeeping, making sure our annotations had good contrast. Also looking at, I guess, not having too many different annotations that people can use. So you'll find some kits have lots and lots and lots of different annotations, but in talking to designers and working with designers and using annotations, we know that sometimes designers are time poor. So, it's how much information do you want to include? As well as that, we found that, if you have a lot of annotations, often it creates a lot of visual clutter. Now, Claire's going to talk about clever ways that we can actually turn on and off annotations using Figma as an example, but we still wanted to make sure that there was not that there's not annotation overload. And so it's some of the core sort of principles that we have used to have a think about how people can use annotations more broadly and also to build out our own kit. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter if you use ours, someone else's, or even design your own. For us, what matters is that you take away what we're talking about today and hopefully can maybe apply that within your organization.
So what is included in our kit? Our annotation system, as Sarah mentioned, is reduced a little bit from the others. It has a little bit less things to use, but we've tried to condense it so that it's really easy and quick to use and you don't have to be confused by too many different annotation options. We'll be referring to Figma specifically in the following examples coming up, but keep in mind that these techniques can be applied anywhere regardless of software. This kit in particular is available in the Figma community. However, you can implement similar things regardless of what software or tools you're using. So our kit includes specific annotation toggles for headings, notes, page regions, keyboard shortcuts, tab order, as well as reading order, as well as some general arrows. We've also included little comment card templates to really bring more documentation to the side of your designs. That way we can add assets onto our designs to mark up different annotations, but we can also have really clear documentation off to the side so we can really get into depth about our documentation when it comes to that time. So the benefit of using the annotation kit in Figma is that we can put everything into assets so that it's really easy and quick to drag and drop annotations onto our design. You don't have to play around with creating little sticky notes or using plugins. You can just drag and drop whenever you need something onto your design. Really saves time and can make it really efficient. It'll just be a case of adjusting the numbering systems, adding our comments, and we can do all that later when our design's more solid.
All right, so on to some examples of how we've used those annotations that we have just mentioned. All right, so let's first of all talk about page regions. So page regions are pretty simple. We want to group content into common regions like your header, your main content, your footer. You might have a few different navigation elements, or regions on a page. And sometimes you might even have some complementary content that actually complements the main content. These are all predefined regions, and usually within a design, we actually group information together into these regions almost naturally. So often our header information is sort of grouped together. We've used proximity to make it look like a group, and even white space then to separate it out from other areas. But this information also needs to be coded, so it is available to assistive technologies. If designers have done that work to think through those page regions and already group the information together, what stops us from actually annotating our designs with that information and also including a little bit extra information such as a label for the region as well, which is going to be the responsibility, we would say, of a content designer.
So in the following examples, we'll be having a look at a web page mockup that's in the Intopia theme for a fake web page called Intopia at ID 24 2021. So on our fake web page, we have a header at the top with the Intopia logo, some search information, a menu. Then we have a big orange banner with our Intopia at 24 information. Then further down the page, we have a little bit of information, some cards about what we do at Intopia. So in our fake page mockup, we have spent all this time as designers thinking about how to separate the information, as Sarah mentioned, where things are placed. Now let's communicate that to the rest of our team. So here we have grouped using our purple borders what content we want in what region of the page and numbered them 1 through 4 to kind of divide them up into what regions we're thinking of, clearly numbering them so we can add some more information later. And the benefit of using this outline is then you can show how specifically the regions are nested within each other. Now we can add some comments to document out the information we have about these regions. So number 1 here, we've done an outline around the top of the page to indicate that the landmark type here will be a header. Nested within that, we have number 2 and 3. We've documented a search region and a navigation region. Because the navigation region, we think there'll be a few on the page. We've added a label for this one. We've named it site. And then following that, we have the main region with all the main content of the page. This way, we've communicated the intent of our design, made it really clear, and now someone can take this away and mark it up successfully so that it will be accessible.
All right, on to our next one, which is headings. So headings are kind of, it's actually what I've called sometimes the bread and butter of navigation, particularly for screen readers. I actually said to a colleague of mine that I considered them the bread and butter of screen reader navigation, and he absolutely agreed as a screen reader user. But it's actually amazing to me how many times when we're reviewing sites or even working with organizations, how headings are still actually not done very well. We want our headings to be well structured. We essentially want every section to have a descriptive heading, and we want those headings to be nested correctly. Now, visually, the hierarchy of headings is often communicated by the font style, the font size, the font weight, but we also want to make sure that the underlying heading levels, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, are also right so that our developers can actually pick that up and code them correctly.
So here we have back again our Intopia ID 24 fake web mock, and we have now had a look at annotating all our headings. So as Sarah mentioned, heading structure can be really vital to the accessibility of our page. Sometimes though, it's a little bit trickier to work out because our heading styles, the size, we might not use consistently on pages. A technique I really like to use is to bring all my text outside the design, all my headings, and have a look, regardless of how they look on the design, have a think about the hierarchy and the intent behind them. So here we bring out all the text to the side of our design, and we've looked at our page heading, Intopia ID 24-2021, that will be our top level heading. And then thinking about how we want things to be structured underneath and what kind of nesting of different heading levels. Once we've worked out what our heading hierarchy will be, regardless of how it looks on the page, we can come back to the design and successfully mark up our headings. H1, H2, H3 is what we've got on the page here to show our intent of what our heading hierarchy will be. Sometimes on a page, one heading might look bigger on one screen and be a H2, might look a little bit smaller on another screen, but it's really important to just think about the hierarchy, the intent behind the structure, what content belongs to what headings, and then we can successfully communicate that through to our developers.
All right. Another fairly simple concept, images. So one thing we think about images is when we use an image on a page, often images might be decorative or they might be informative. Again, we feel like this is something that we can address at that design stage. It's usually the designers that understand why that image has been placed there, and then also what that information that image is communicating if it is an informative image. So being able to identify and mark up our designs to say, this image is decorative and this image is informative. And when there is an informative image, provide that alt text. So all our developers need to do is go, right, I've got an informative image here. I've got my alt text. I know that I need to make sure it's marked up correctly as an image with a role of image. My alt text is there and I'm done.
So let's have a look now about how we can annotate some images to show this information. Annotating images can be really handy, particularly if you have a separate copywriter or UX writer. They can come in and help you out with alternative text early on. Let's not leave it to assumptions and guesses when it's too late. Let's think about it up front, because alternative text can be really important to how our designs are communicated. So here, our first example, we have a little pink card, take a break, grab a coffee and relax, with a grab a coffee call to action button at the bottom. That's a bit of a tongue twister, button at the bottom. And in the middle, we have a little man holding a big coffee cup. This is just there to add a little bit of flair to the card. And we want this image to be marked up as decorative when our developers build it. So here we've added a little note, annotation, and then on the side, we've added a comment card to indicate that this image will be decorative. Now, depending on your organization and how you handle images, you might have a lot of decorative images or not very many. It's I think you can develop your own internal rules around image management. You might have some internal rules that all images are decorative unless we've specifically marked them up with something else. Or you might, if you don't have very many decorative images, add an annotation every time. Just depends on what your organization does and ways you find to save time when you're annotating things. On our second example, we have a social media card with 3 icon links at the bottom for Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So because these are little icons that are linking us to our social media pages, we really want the alternative text on these to be really clear. Someone knows what's going to happen when we click these links. So we've added some note annotations to those for 2, 3, and 4. Then we've added some comment cards on the side to indicate that these are images and what the alternative text should be. So Intopia on Facebook, Intopia on Twitter, Intopia on LinkedIn.
All right, so our next annotation, the next annotation type we're going to talk about is actually everything to do with order. So usually when we're looking at the order in which content is presented, and in particular, the order in which content is presented to assistive technologies, we want to make sure that we show what that content order is and also what the focus order is. So if someone is using, say, a keyboard or a keyboard alternative and they're tabbing through a page, what is the focus order? Which items are they going to start tabbing through and what's that order? We also, focus is actually a little bit more complex than that. It's not necessarily just as we tab through what order we're going through, but also what happens if we have a dynamic content change where we might actually need to do a bit of focus management. Now, this one probably is, we still actually say that focus order and focus management is actually the responsibility of the designer. Often there are decisions to be made when we do actually, create our design. What is that content order? What is that focus order? We do have a quite complex page, sometimes it's not that traditional left to right, up to down. Also, when it comes to that focus management and where we're going to set focus when someone interacts with something, that is a form of interaction. It's just interacting with the keyboard. And there are user experience decisions that we need to make there. Where do we set focus? It needs to be logical, but it needs to be logical for, say, someone who's sighted, who can see the interface, but also someone who's non-sighted, let's say, and actually maybe using a screen reader. So there's a lot that actually goes into this. It's not just a case of, oh, yep, okay, I need to set focus somewhere, let's arbitrarily set focus.
So let's have a look at some examples now about how we can use these annotations. We can use our tab order and our reading order annotations separately or in combination. In these two examples, we'll be using them together. So here we're designing some news article cards. We're having a look at the initial design. We've got our cards laid out with some Alice in Wonderland placeholder text for now, with the date at the top of the card, followed by our heading, a few interactive tags, a short preview of the article, and then a call to action link at the bottom. So when we were designing these, we're thinking, the date will be good at the top so that someone visually scanning the information can see what article is the most recent. But when we're thinking about our interaction design, we'll be aware that someone navigating via headings will want the heading first so that they don't miss out on the date. So we've had a look at the reading order for these examples, and we've marked it up 1 through to 7, what will be reading order and what will be an interactive element. So here we've got the heading marked up as the first item that someone will read when they come to the card, followed by number 2, the date. Then we'll come down, 3, 4, and 5 will be interactive tab stops for the 3 interactive tags we have here, followed by 6, a reading order for the paragraph introduction. And then 7, again, we have another interactive tab stop for the call to action link. This way, we're really communicating our intent behind the design and what we expect the interaction patterns to be like. So here we've added a note for number 2, just to really communicate our intent behind this decision. We have that the date order, the date is specifically ordered after the card heading to assist users navigating via headings. Let's have a look at another example now, switching a little bit to some more focus management. So here we have a modal. Modals are one of the items we find is the most commonly overlooked when it comes to focus management. So here we have our Intopia ID24 Intopia at ID24 web mock page again. A user has come here and clicked the contact us button at the top of the page, and a contact us modal has displayed. So here we've marked up a few different annotations to really help communicate how the keyboard pattern will work and how the focus management will be handled. Firstly, we've added a note to the original contact us link to show what the trigger is for the modal. We've added a note here to say this button has triggered the modal, and that once the modal is closed, that's where the focus should return back to. So we've thought about where a user will come from and where they will return back to when the modal is closed. We've also thought a little bit about keyboard shortcuts here. We're thinking we really want someone to be able to press escape to close the modal. So we've added a little escape key shortcut at the top of the modal and added some documentation to the side to communicate pressing the escape key will close the modal and where the focus will return back to once that button has been pressed. Then finally, we have some of those tab order and reading order annotations on the modal to indicate where someone will land when they come on the modal and how the keyboard focus will be managed. So in this example, the first tab stop will be at the top on the close button, followed by some reading order on some text, a heading and an introduction to the form, followed by a few more interactive tab stops on the form components. There was a name, email, and a message field, then followed by a few more tab stops for a cancel and send message button. We have some extra notes on the side here to show our intent behind the design as well, to communicate that the modal traps focus. Once the modal content has been accessed, focus will move in a circle through the modal until it's closed. That way we're communicating everything someone, when they build this modal, needs to know about how the interaction pattern works before it's been built.
I'm sure I can hear little screams in the background going, why are you using for a modal for a contact form? Trust me, it's an example.
It was the easiest one to build to make an example of.
Cool. All right. So we've talked about regions, headings, content order, and images. Now, generally speaking, we can actually, there's some of our fundamental things that we can mark up, but we may also want to provide even more information. And this is a bit more what I'd say technical information. And not all designers may know this, but it's all those lovely semantics. We know that often when we've got a button, for instance, that button's going to have a role of button. Whatever the label is, it's going to have a visible label, and that's going to be our name. We have states and properties as well. If we're doing, say, a button with a ARIA has pop-up, that's going to be a property that we can add to it. So we can actually use our annotation system to add that additional information if you would like to.
So here, let's look at another example of a component we're pretending to build here for an accordion. It's got our lovely Alice in Wonderland placeholder text in there. We've already come through and had a look at our heading structure, how we want the modal, the accordions to be structured in terms of our heading hierarchy. But now let's think about some extra stuff we can add. As Sarah mentioned, some of this information might be a little bit extra, but this is where collaboration with your whole team can come in. This stuff's really important to be documented somewhere. Why not add it into your designs in collaboration with your test team and your developers up front? So here we've added a note to one of our accordions to communicate the extra properties that it will need. So in our comment card to the side where all our documentation is, we have that these are accordions. They will have a role of button, and the states they will have are either expanded or collapsed. There is an option here if you do want to add extra information for test cases to even build that out further. So we've included a second example below that has that same information, but also some extra information we can use to build test cases. So here we have what we expect a screen reader output will include. So it will include the heading level, the role, the name, and the state. That way a tester can look out for this information and what we expect of our voice input to be. So someone calling this element will need the either or both the name and role information. One more thing to keep in mind before we move on to having a look at design systems is layer management. As Sarah mentioned, when we're adding annotations, there are things we can do to make it easier for them to be used. So in this example, we have a screenshot from Figma showing the layers panel on the side and then our lovely Entopia mock page in the middle. And here what we've done is added the annotation layers at the top of our layers so that they're really easy to access, and we've grouped them together. That way we can hide and show the annotations when we need them or when we don't need them, making it so we don't have to have multiple versions of a page. We can export it all if we want to export it without the annotations or with the annotations. Further from that as well, we can also group our annotation types so we can turn them on and off individually. So we might want to export one version of the page just showing our page regions or just showing our headings. If we have our layer management set up well for our annotations, it makes it even more efficient to turn it on and off different annotation types and easily hide them or show them when they're required.
Fantastic. So we wanted to briefly touch on annotations within design systems. So many organizations are creating design systems to make things more efficient and effective. And we also want to make our annotations and also accessibility within our designs also efficient and effective as well. So we can actually look at how do we use design systems and annotations to do this. So design systems can be really great for accessibility. They're really great for scaling. So if you're a large organization, you've got lots of different websites or even just one really, really big website. Having those components and building those components to be accessible means that when you do use them, you do have that level of confidence that they have actually been built with accessibility in mind. Of course, we do absolutely have to then put them together in an accessible way. The work is still not done, but I have seen with many of the organizations I've worked with how effective this can be and how it can really reduce the number of accessibility issues I was finding within different designs. It's also great for consistency. So it means that, any time that you use that component, it is a consistent component, which leads to a consistent experience for your users. It also reduces that effort as well, because you have done those components and you have built them to be accessible. It's also great for building accessibility knowledge across your organization. It's almost exactly the same thing as Claire said, where we said annotations can make accessibility kind of just the norm, those annotations are there. They're accessibility annotations. Let's talk about them. Same with actually having a design system that is accessible. It makes accessibility normal and business as usual. So the two call outs we wanted to speak about are first of all, colour. So obviously we want to use colours that contrast well for all important information, and we can actually look at how we do that within our design system.
So colour can be one of those tricky things that we have brand colours and we want to use them in our design. How can we kind of work around that if they won't produce accessible text colours and things like this? So in this example, what I did when I brought in all the Intopia brand colours is I had a look and thought about how we could use them in an accessible way. So one of the key things we can do is make sure we have plenty of shades and tints of that colour available to our designers in our design system so that it can be really flexible and we can have something that suits our brand palette, but can also create accessible designs. The second thing is to really bring in contrast values and contrast ratios into our components so that it's really clear why we've chosen those colors for the component and how they impact accessibility. So here we have a few color swatches of all our different combinations that we know will result in accessible designs. We have a column that has all the color combinations that are okay for text, and then another column that has all the color combinations that are okay for non-text or for large text. That way, when someone's coming to have a look at colors, they can see what colors we're allowed to use together that will result in accessible designs. And there will be lots of options that we can use. A thing I like to do when I'm building components in a design system is also have these color swatches at the bottom that shows the two colors and their contrast values and what they can be used for. That way, when someone's coming to look at that component in their design system, they can really see your intent and why those colors are used together and why it's important for them to maintain that contrast ratio. It's important to also have at the top here some information around WCAG color contrast ratios, because it can be tricky to remember the values for different requirements. Having those rules clearly outlined and documented in your design system can really help build up that understanding and the expectation of what colors, what the minimum requirements are for colors.
And To extend on colours, we often use colours to convey different states or information. So the outline of a checkbox, the actual check state, also things like focus and hover states. We often see, this is again one of those areas that we actually see, sometimes people get text contrast right, but they sometimes forget about some of these other aspects. So we can actually build that into our system as well.
So when we have all our states outlined for a component, here we have an example of a component for a text field with a label. We really need to think about all the states that that component can have. Key things that are often overlooked for accessibility are particularly keyboard focused states are often missing from design libraries. Also, what's going to happen when it has an error is quite often overlooked for accessibility. So here we have examples of the text field when it has hint text, when it doesn't have hint text, when it has an error message, and when it has both hint text and an error message. And then we have all our different states. What's it going to look like when someone's inputted text into the text field? What does it look like when we've hovered on it with the mouse? What's it look like when it's disabled and when it has keyboard focus? And then we can really have a look at the accessibility for all those states. Has non-text and text contrast been maintained for all our states? It's quite common for text contrast to be lacking when something's hovered on with the mouse, or for text contrast to be lacking once it's got focus with the keyboard. It's really important that we maintain that across all our states. We're having a look as well at states combined together. So what's it look like when it has an error and keyboard focus is another area that often accessibility is missing. That way we can have a look to make sure, Sarah mentioned, that the color is good. We're not relying on only color for any of these states. And people can come and check the accessibility before it's implemented and have a look. We can improve on the component and all its states before we build it.
All right, so what is next? We have 3 things that we would love you to do. The first one, have a go. Download an annotation kit. If you really want to build your own, but actually have a go at annotations. I hope that we've proved that annotations can be really valuable, and so have a bit of a play with them. The other thing is start small. Maybe there is one area in your organization that perhaps isn't working so well. Maybe heading structure isn't maybe being considered as well, or perhaps it's getting lost between, say, design and development. Perhaps just think about annotating your headings and see the improvement that it makes. Also, lead the way. We've talked a lot today about making accessibility normal, just part of what we do. And we feel that actually doing this and, sharing your experiences in maybe using some annotations is you leading the way within your organization and also within the broader community.
So what's next for us at Intopia? We've launched, as Sarah mentioned, our first annotation kit in the Figma community. You can find us by searching Intopia in the community or by going to figma.com/@Intopia, and that's the @ symbol. So check us out on there, give us some feedback of what you think. As Sarah mentioned, check out all the other annotation kits on Figma. There are a lot there. They're good for different things. You might find ours a bit bland, but there's lots of exciting ones on Figma as well. We're planning on doing some upcoming versions and improvements in the future, so things like light and dark modes to suit different prototypes, light mode, dark mode. So keep an eye on our socials for upcoming content, including related blogs or instructionals. And feel free to give us feedback of what you'd like to see in our annotation kit. We're really open to adding some new things in there in our next version.
All right, so for anyone who's hanging on those slides, you can actually find the slides at bit.ly/Intopia-ID24-2021. That will take you to the slides on SlideShare. And also get in contact with us. So Sarah TP or Claire L. Weber on Twitter, or you can even email us. The easiest email on that slide is probably hello@intopia.digital, and that will come to us. Thank you all so much, and we're open for questions.
Thank you, Claire and Sarah, both of you. I enjoyed that talk. Thank you very much. Sarah, do we have any questions?
I have a couple. Sarah, specifically, you talked about annotation overload in one of the sections. I was wondering if you had any examples of information that you think should be left out. Like what would be over annotation overload?
Look, I think it depends on two things. One, I think Claire's example of having internal rules to minimize the amount of annotations that you're using. I think that would be one of those examples where, you're always looking for efficiencies so that it's not, just, oh my gosh, there's, 20 little annotations on here and I need to look them all up. So that would be one of my first examples. I think the second example is, where do we end up putting how much information do we provide? So our examples where we've got the calling out the role states and properties of a particular component. We probably would want to, if you were, say, an organization using a design system, I would say you'd probably want to annotate the individual component within the design system, but not every single instance of that component you've popped on a page. It's sort of what I call the component level information and the page level information. Stick the component level information in the component, stick the page level information, on when you build that page, but then work with your organization to make sure that works though. And that's the key for me, is just making sure it works for however your organization, however the individuals want to work. If it's fine, you find that it's hidden away in your component library and actually people aren't referencing it, well, then you've got to do something about that. Is it an education piece? Is it maybe you do have to have lots and lots of annotations at a page level? It's really about the outcome.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So more like make sure like information for any given section or markup is cool. You mentioned the semantics and this role state information, which is great. My next question is about that for both of you. So I was wondering if you've ever found that this results in kind of an overuse of ARIA. This might come a little bit from personal experience, where I've noticed if you put on a design that it should have a certain role or certain name or something, sometimes developers will want to do that explicitly, or will then look for a way to set that explicitly as opposed to it happening naturally from the element you use or the content you put in it. Is this something you found? Is there a way to mitigate that? If so, or do you just have awesome developers?
I think it comes back to a lot about internal education and documentation of expectations around that, so that we have a common understanding of when native elements should be used and when we should be using ARIA, and education about how ARIA works. It's really important that in your annotation documentation, you're keeping things technology and ambiguous, or whatever the term is, so that you're documenting just that it should be a button, it should have these roles, rather than explicitly saying role equals button that needs to have this ARIA element. That way a developer can make a choice depending on what internal things are going on for them, how they can build it technically. Same with alternative text, specifying the text itself, not how it should be implemented. That way the developer can choose to implement it in the way that works best at the time for them. Are really important as well.
Yep, I absolutely agree. I think that underlying education, as Claire said, is that's about the only way to solve it. I guess, we see role name value and we know that a native element comes with that, but potentially a developer who's new to accessibility doesn't. So if you teach those fundamentals, and actually when we run developer training, my colleague actually does I think it's what they call a clickathon activity. So they actually get someone to build a custom button and go through all those steps of adding role and, adding name, and then, putting all the keyboard event handlers and that kind of thing, and then get to the end and then go, oh, and by the way, if we used a native button, all you need to do was, button name, button. markup, and you're done. And that's like, I think that's the biggest aha moment for developers and engineers, where you actually show that level of effort of one versus another. Yes, occasionally we need custom controls, but that education around the value of native controls, I think that's where we need to start.
So make developers suffer and then they'll learn.
Did I say that?
Well, I mean, I'm a developer. I approve this message. Cool. Yeah. I'm also, so I'm kind of curious. So like, in another question that I haven't fully like written down, but so apologies if this isn't concise, but
Okay.
like something I've noticed is like across different organizations and teams and things like that, there will be like varying levels of like accessibility knowledge in design versus development. And sometimes design will know way more, sometimes developers will know way more, just depending on who's there. This puts a lot of like the decision making on the side of design. Is there a way to balance that if you have a team where your developers happen to know more, like to make sure that they can like, how do you balance who has knowledge, and do you like, I guess I'm wondering if you're talking to a team that has like less design knowledge and more development accessibility knowledge, is there a way you would modify this so it's still thought of in design but not mandated? If you have a team that has the reverse, would you give different advice for how to use these toolkits?
I think annotation and documentation doesn't have to be a solo responsibility. So it doesn't have to be all on the designer or the person that made the design. It can be something that can be really collaborative. You can bring everyone together and have that knowledge sharing across both teams if both parties are working together to annotate the designs beforehand. It has lots of benefits of having your developers across your design tools too. That way they can jump in and comment on tech feasibility, on accessibility, and get lots of CSS information. Particularly Figma has so many goodies in there for developers. So having your developers across your design tools are knowing enough to be able to get in there and find what they need to build it can be really handy as well. And while they're in there, adding annotations, adding comments, marking up how they think things will work in collaboration with the designers can be really valuable.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that, I've often been surprised where you've got teams, where perhaps, I've seen designs where as an accessibility, person, I know from a development perspective, it's going to be really, really hard or almost impossible to actually make accessible. And so, to Claire's point about that communication, I think that's the key with those annotations. So even if your designers are, say, learning about heading structure, but your developers know more, what if your designers have a go, but then your developers are coming and actually working with the designers to say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? Is that quite right there? That opens up that conversation that I find very rarely does actually happen between the design and dev teams. Often it's design passes it over, dev does something, and then design comes and says, oh, I didn't quite mean it like that. That's sort of usually what happens. Whereas it's almost that shift left, but it's the shift left about the conversation that happens between the different people in the team.
I
Really
have to
like
be
that.
the resident buzzkill. I'm sorry to say, but we have to get set up for the next talk. So I'm going to interrupt you here. I'm sure people can continue to engage you on the Twitters and the other platforms as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
I have a little bit of script I have to run through here, so bear with me a moment. To our viewers, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community. You can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters: Intopia, Fable, TPGI Arc, Adobe, Tetralogical, Intuit, InfoAxia, Center for Inclusive Design, Web Directions AAA, Adrian Roselli LLC, and Can Access. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. We'll see you then. Claire, Sarah, thank you. Also, Sarah, thank you.